Yeah, and continuing on, I ran across some reports that, that China's planning to buy 93 billion in gold. Adding to this, as you were mentioning about the world government, the Russian president recently showing a coin that's, it's this proposed world currency, nuclear world currency. And, with all this, and also with the Amero in mind, with all this in mind, the question is, how long do the Canadians and Americans and other dollars is it going to be before we crash? And the most important thing, what kind of exchange are they going to give for our dollars that we have in savings at this time? Is it going to be at par, or is it going to be 50% or 60% of what we have?
Well, I would presume, and this is only an assumption on my part, I would presume it would be, they would set an arbitrary exchange rate, and that would be, what you would get for it. It's like dollars to euros and dollars to Ameros and dollars to Globos. It would have to be perceived as fair and just in terms of equivalent monetary power in the new currency, or you're going to have riots on their hands. You're not going to have people who are going to trade away enough money to buy a Lamborghini in exchange for enough money to buy a Volkswagen. No offense to Volkswagens, it was my first car and I loved it. But the idea being that the people at large have to be convinced that this is a good idea and it's going to make their lives a lot better going over to this new economic system. The problem with any reserve bank, as we've seen here in the United States, because you have a private bank issuing the currency for the entire nation, or in this case the entire world, at interest, the instant it goes into operation, more money is owed to that central bank than is actually in existence. And so the nation or the planet can never, ever, ever get out of debt, no matter how hard it works. That's the reason the United States is in such financial trouble right now with our government $65 trillion in debt. Is because of the banking system. We threw away the banking system that worked when we started this country. Our Congress sold us into bondage to a privately owned bank in exchange for campaign donations and, other wealth. And that's the situation we're in right now. And now they're trying to expand themselves into a global version of the same enslavement mechanism.
And I was brought to my attention by a friend of mine. He brought to my attention that apparently back in just before World War II, about 1930s, when Japan was taking over Manchuria, the Chinese had their treasury right there. So what the Chinese did, they were contacted by the Federal Reserve, which is privately owned, as you're pointing out, and the Federal Reserve said to them, "Okay, we'll take this treasury and we'll keep it for you safely." So they took it out of China, and then they basically brought it over to the United States. And also there was some over in the Philippines and other nations. And this treasury right now, they promised to keep it for 70 years. They kept the bond, and they said, okay, when the Chinese emperor, you can come and collect this in 70 years. And that 70 years came due on September 12th, 2001. And what happened was the person that was doing this article is Benjamin Fulford, who we're going to be having on as a guest in August 10th on our show here. And what happened, according to the article, what was pointed out was he was saying that because the communists took over China, and allegedly the last Chinese emperor was kept as a gardener for the rest of his life, the owners of the Federal Reserve thought, okay, well, we don't have to pay the Chinese emperor. But lo and behold, one of his relatives managed to escape, and his great-grandson showed up and said to the Federal Reserve, I want my money. Here's my bonds. I want my money. And they're saying, no, we're not going to pay you. But what the Chinese emperor did is he kept enough in reserve so that he could fight them. Now, what's happening is when this does come due, what I've read in the article, it basically states that, that this reserve has to pay it back, but the reserve is going to try to pawn it off on the American people, and this in itself could actually crash the system. Have you heard anything about this? And also at the same time, why aren't the private families, more than likely, there's probably Kennedy's name in there also, why aren't they being forced to pay this back because they're the ones that took this to begin with?
Well, ultimately, when you have rich and powerful banking and financial interests, they're always going to try and figure out some way to dump the costs on the people. That's what happened with the bailout in the last September. As far as China's gold, the position of the Federal Reserve, as I understand it, is that the money was entrusted to them not by the personality of Yisinjiro Puyi, the last emperor of China, but in his position, not as a private individual, but in his position as head of the Chinese government in existence at that time. So the Federal Reserve's position is, even though his descendants still live, they are not entitled to that money because they are no longer the government of China. They are simply private citizens. It's like the example would be if Barack Obama entrusted, say, $1 million in the nation's gold bullion up to Canada and the Royal Canadian Mint or something, and then the government of the U.S. fell. Obama's children couldn't go up to Canada and say, give us back our money, because it wasn't really theirs personally. It was transferred by President Obama in his role as custodian for the U.S. government. So that's the position of the Federal Reserve. We have, in fact, one of the family of Isinjiro Puyi's descendants actually lives right here on Oahu, and we see him showing up at the various protests and peace marches, and he's not interested in the Federal Reserve money, and he doesn't think they're ever going to get it. He just wants recognition that the imperial family does still exist, and so it's a big, ugly situation. But the bottom line is, large banks and governments, once they've got the money, they're always going to find an excuse not to give it back. That's how they became rich and powerful.
Yeah, and also in the past, I've had a chance to talk to Foster and Pono, who are from Hawaii, and they're telling me an awful lot of stuff that's happening right now. But we're going to take we're getting ready to take a quick break, real quick. We'd ask you to stay on the line, and we're going to come back and talk about my favorite subjects, 9/11 and OKC bombing and stuff like that. When we come back, I just like to remind our listening audience to listen to Co-op Radio 102.7 FM CFRO. Monday Brown Bagger. Our guest is Michael Rivero, and we're going to take a quick break, and then we ask you to stay online, Michael, and we're going to come back in about 5 minutes.